Hello and welcome back to the Hazzabhajan YouTube channel. It is Harry here, and today it is time for another biopic, if you like, or mini documentary style video. We're not actually doing it on a player who has played recently though, but instead we're reverting to a trend of making videos about when football didn't really matter. A quote which I absolutely despise. For example, people online say anything before 1992, maybe the 1970s in an absolute push, can be disregarded, but doing so would be like saying that any music written before the Romantic era is futile and not worthy of being considered as genuine music. If that sounds like a ludicrous statement to make, then that's because it is. Much like the one that many people propagate with football, with it being supposedly created in 1992, and anything before that is supposedly irrelevant. Yes, of course, diets and training regimes definitely weren't on par with what they are now, but that doesn't mean to say that there aren't any amazing footballers pre-1970, as there are, obviously, a plethora of them. One of them who has slipped under the radar somewhat is a goalkeeper who is the subject of today's video, by the name of Leigh Roose, the world's first amateur superstar. If you go on to enjoy this little documentary, slap a like on the video, subscribe if you haven't done so already, and comment what you think of the whole situation. Well, it's the whole story, I guess. But without further ado, let's get into it. Roose was born in 1877 to a Presbyterian priest in the town of Holt in North Wales. Roose's name was the reverse of his father's name, Richmond Leigh Roose, but unfortunately he suffered tragedy at the age of just 4 after his mother contracted cancer during childbirth of their next child in 1879, from which she would never recover, dying in 1881 at the age of just 34. Roose was raised along with his 4 other siblings by their father, and he had his heart originally set on a career in medicine, jumping at the chance to study medicine at the University of Wales's branch in Aberystwyth. Although he was talented at football too, he always saw it as a pastime, never wanting to take the game up professionally, but many recognised his abilities as a goalkeeper from an early age, and he decided to join the Aberystwyth University football team to go alongside his studies. Word of his talent spread like wildfire across the university, and attendances grew and grew, just so that they could get a glimpse of this prodigious talent in full flight. Of course, if you are the reason why such numbers are being drawn, you have to appease them, and Roose did just that, continuously chatting to the spectators, especially those of the other sex, during the game. His popularity was clear for all to see, as was his enigmatic character, showcased by him running onto the pitch pre-match instead of walking, as was commonplace at the time, and pacing back and forth in his penalty box, muttering incomprehensible sentences to himself just before the game was about to start. No one could quite figure him out, but he was clearly a showman. He was asked by Aberystwyth Town in 1899, the year when his studies ended, if he would be happy filling in goal for them, as their main goalkeeper had left for Manchester City. He obliged, putting in stunning displays as they made waves in the English and Welsh games, winning 3 trophies including the Welsh Cup in 1900. And a first senior cap arrived that year in a home nations match against Ireland. Roose's antics in that game were unlike any seen before on the international front, as he went out to challenge a striker a long way away from his penalty area, clattering into him spectacularly, as well as running to the halfway line with the ball in his grasp and launching it into the Ireland penalty area, only returning to it when the Welsh attack eventually broke down. If the former part sounds normal to you, it's because Roose was one of the pioneers of the sweeper keeper mentality, made much more high profile by Lev Yashin and Amadeo Carrizo in the 1960s, and keepers like Manuel Neuer and Edison today. If the latter part sounds outlandish, it's because goalkeepers were, at this time, allowed to handle the ball anywhere up to the halfway line. This meant that, as Roose so correctly and lawfully demonstrated in this game, they could feasibly run with the ball in their hands right up to said line, boot it down the pitch, and cause chaos for the other team. At this point in time, however, most of the standard goalkeepers chose not to exploit this law, mostly staying at home in the penalty area, waiting to be called into action when necessary. But Roose, obviously, was not normal, and as George Hooley put it, he was one of the few who could pull off such a move successfully. He still prioritised his medical studies with the ambition of becoming a doctor, and he moved to London in 1900 to pursue his dream, working full-time as an assistant in King's College Hospital. He joined London Welsh in the meantime, but word of his talent spread even further, especially after a fine performance against Scotland in 1901. Scotland had scored 16 goals in their 3 previous outings against the Welsh, who were normally the whipping boys of the home nations tournament contested between England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. In this game though, Roose repelled all that they had to throw at him barring one shot, and Wales were able to scrape a 1-1 draw thanks to the heroics of their maverick goalkeeper. His career looked to have been thrown up in the air after enrolling in King's bacteriology course for that year, but a telegram from Stoke City changed his mind. They were looking for amateurs to play for expenses only, owing to their financial strife at the time, and Roose accepted on the conditions that he could continue living and studying in London. Stoke gave him unlimited expenses, including first-class travel and living facilities, designer clothes, and let's just say extras on the person front. It nearly broke FA payment rules to amateur players, but just about avoided it. Roose by now was, as his biographer Spencer Vigna put it, a professional in all but name. The hope with Roose's arrival was that Stoke's plight would be transformed from relegation dogfights to normal title challenges, and that attendances would rise as a result of his appearance on the pitch, and of course as a result of his showmanship. Both of those aims were matched, as many flocked to see this mercurial genius in action. On his debut, he bowed to all four sides of the pitch, swung on the crossbar, and carried out his ritual of muttering in the penalty box, all of which entertained the crowd no end. Throughout his time with the Potters, he would turn to the crowd and mock mistakes or praise exceptional play, which proved a treat when at home, but less so when he played away, as was potentially to be expected, including being hit by a coin by a Sheffield United fan during one game at Bramall Lane. He adopted an approach of wobbling his knees when a striker was about to take a penalty in an attempt to put him off, foreseeing the trend of goalkeepers putting off the penalty takers during a shootout, which we so often see today. He also became a minor celebrity, potentially as a result of his expenses, dating high-profile stars at the time constantly, including famous musical star Mary Lloyd, who, at the time of her relationship with Roose, was already married. As such, Roose would find himself as frequently in the sporting sections of the newspapers as he did in the tabloidy showbiz sections. You might say, well, that's all well and good, but was he actually genuinely really good? Well, to put it bluntly, yes. He had tremendous agility and reflexes, and his kamikaze approach to goalkeeping meant that he was always involving himself in the action whenever it was necessary. His shot-stopping ability was on another level to those around him, and he was frequently the scourge of many teams and barely made any mistakes in spite of his adventurousness, with many contemporaries praising him as one of the finest players in the Football League and possibly the best goalkeeper at the time. So much so that he was asked by many newspapers to write about his experiences as a goalkeeper at a time when players' views were not as widespread as they are now. One of his writings showcased the memo for a sweeper keeper, stating that, quote, "A goalkeeper should take in the position at once and at a glance and, if deemed necessary, come out of his goal immediately and go head first into a pack into which many men would hesitate to insert a foot. I'm convinced that the reason why goalkeepers don't come out of their goal more often is their regard for personal consequences. If a forward has to be met and charged down, do not hesitate to charge with all your might." Unfortunately, Stoke's financial situation, coupled with them being near the bottom of the league, it is worth bearing in mind that Roose is one of the only good players in Stoke's team, maybe even the only good player, led to them needing to cut back on Roose's lucrative expenses. Roose, outraged that they had backtracked on their promises, cancelled his contract and retired there and then at the age of just 26, deciding to focus solely on his studies, which he had been delaying for a few years as a result of his exploits at Stoke. He grew to miss the thrill of the field, however, and when Everton called him up just a few months later, he wasn't going to turn them down. He helped the club turn their fortunes around and challenge for the league and cup, in spite of a massive error on his debut, missing a simple cross to concede the only goal of the game against Sunderland. Ultimately, they would miss out on both, and an argument with the manager led to Roose's departure after just 5 months at the Merseysiders. He rejoined Stoke, who were willing to pay his expenses once more, but he also took part in the match which is the oldest surviving football match which was filmed, as Sagar Mitchell and James Kenyon's pioneering tape focused on the Wales vs Ireland Home Nations match. Only 2.5 minutes survives today, and it is the only film of Roose in action, but there is at least something. Unfortunately, his temperamental character then came into force once again, as he punched a Sunderland supporter in a post-match meal, leading to a suspension for 2 weeks. Putting that to one side, he helped Wales, previously of course the whipping boys of the competition, win their first ever Home Nations Championship in 1907, although he was relegated with Stoke that same season, and as their finances dried up, so too did Roose's expenses. Having been subtly criticised by a high-ranking official in the newspaper, he only made one appearance in the second tier for the Potters before leaving for good in October 1907. Despite the fracas in 1906, he ended up joining Sunderland, being the most pivotal factor in their survival, as they could score plenty, but their defence was woeful. He was kept busy, of course, because Sunderland's defence was, at the time, woeful, but he enjoyed being busy, playing some of his best football to date, so much so that Sunderland asked if they could reward him with a testimonial just after 1 season at the club. The FA refused, as they stated that only professionals could gain testimonials and not amateurs like Roose, supposedly, was. His expenses were finally called into question by the FA as to whether or not they broke the rules, but Sunderland produced receipts stating that he was only being paid for his travel, and the FA were powerless to do anything more about it. Roose was getting away with murder. Then, in November 1909, Roose broke his wrist in an incident with a Newcastle player trying to kick the ball out of his hands, not returning to full match fitness for a year and, to be honest, never really returning to his very, very high peak, making more mistakes than ever before. He won his 24th and final Wales cap in 1910, and he eventually had to leave Sunderland, turning out for Celtic, Arsenal and Aston Villa, amongst a couple of others, over the next 2 years. He also turned out for Port Vale solely in a game against Stoke, but the Potters fans, angry at Roose, invaded the pitch when Vale went 2-0 up. But Roose escaped the scene as quickly as possible, perhaps sensing the imminent danger. In 1912, the FA, with whom Roose had a negative relationship as a result of his lucrative expenses, finally changed the rule about goalkeepers being able to handle the ball wherever they so please in their own half, now restricting the goalkeepers to only being able to handle the ball inside their own penalty area. This was as a result of Roose's antics of picking up the ball and taking it wherever he so pleased, as the FA saw it as a massive advantage to those who exploited this rule, which, it is worth bearing in mind, very few did. Although it seemed as though he would retire following the conclusion of the 1911-12 season, during which he'd made plenty of mistakes at Arsenal, this rule change all but confirmed it. He finally returned to a life of medicine, fulfilling that role over the next 2 years. However, football, much like general life as a whole, was flipped on its head completely after the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. Immediately, hundreds of thousands of able British men conscripted for the war effort, some under pressure to do so, but some out of pure gallantry and patriotism. Roose was one such figure, in spite of his age being 37 at this stage, signing up to be a part of the Young Men's Christian Association in France, Malta, Lemnos in Greece, and eventually Alexandria in Egypt. However, it was while stationed in Egypt in 1915 that his family were told that Roose had gone missing, and his body wasn't found, although first-hand accounts from soldiers who'd served alongside him confirmed to the family that this wasn't true, and that Roose had actually transferred to the army to fight on the front line. Roose was sent to the Somme, where, in October 1916, like so many other British soldiers before and after him, his battalion was instructed to go over the top, into no man's land. Within about 10 minutes of the command, it is widely believed that Roose was killed and his body has never been found. Unfortunately, any record of him in the battalion which he was actually in was expunged, as though 4 Rooses were killed in said battalion, none were named Leigh according to the records. The truth was only revealed to the family in 2003, by which point all of Leigh's closest affiliates, namely his siblings and his parents, had sadly died. Roose's surname, quite simply, had been misspelled, as on their books it said that he was Leigh R-O-U-S-E as opposed to Leigh R-O-O-S-E, as was his actual surname spelling. The only family member who knew about this, who knew Leigh personally, was his nephew, Dick Jenkins, with Helena, Leigh's sister, spending most of the rest of her life desperately attempting to find out what happened to him, but all of her efforts, as you might have gathered, proved in vain. His name was put on a plaque in Calais commemorating those soldiers who could never be sent to their grave in a formal ceremony, but of course his name was spelt wrong again, and only corrected in December 2015. Sadly, however, Jenkins wouldn't quite get round to seeing this change, as he passed away in 2008, just before his 103rd birthday. Those pieces of the puzzle which I just mentioned were put together as a result of Spencer Venus's work, alongside many others, and without them, Roose's name would still be spelt wrong, and it would mean that allegedly he didn't exist. If you were to sum up Roose, it would probably be something along the lines of a national superstar, both in the footballing world and in the showbiz world, too, but with the ability and showmanship to live up to his billing, and someone who revolutionised the landscape of goalkeeping, although his methods wouldn't be used until some 40 to 50 years after his death, and arguably not commonplace until nearly a century on. To quote Vigna one more time, he was supposedly, quote, the first football superstar, with the playing style of Peter Schmeichel, the bon vivant attitude of George Best, and the media-savvy sense of David Beckham. You can't attract much higher praise or more completeness than that. But that just about wraps up today's video. Thank you very much for watching / listening, depending on what you decided to do with this video. Hit the like button if you found it interesting or enjoyed it. Comment down below also with any other players you want me to do a biography or mini documentary on, because I'd be more than happy to research and do some in-depth analysis and stuff and find out about what happened to them. So please do let me know other ideas in the comments down below. And of course, whilst you're here, hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you then.